Welcome to today's Thirsty for Knowledge Thursday broadcast. My name is Benjamin Sigall. I'm a senior attorney here at McMurray & Shuster. I'm a litigator within our cannabis practice group. My focus is on hemp and CBD. I also handle the intellectual property matters, or many of them that come into the firm. I'm here today with our subject matter expert in our cannabis practice group, Chad Blackham. He's an expert when it comes to the marijuana side of things, and he's very familiar with the hemp side as well. Chad?
Thank you, Ben, for that wonderful introduction, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here. My name is Chad Blackham, and this is Call Centers, Cannabis and Compliance, Entering the Emerging Cannabis Industry. I head up our cannabis, CBD, and hemp practice group here. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm just thrilled to be able to do this with you. You saw the headlines, you saw the email. This is a big industry. There's a lot of money at play, and they need good call centers, which is why you're all here. Disclaimer, not the most fun thing. But we got to get this out of the way right away. The materials in this presentation are informational only, and they are not legal advice. Now, if you have specific legal questions, always please consult the advice of your counsel or an attorney. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the agenda. We're going to start off today with a general overview of cannabis law. Now, I know what you're thinking, Chad, I don't care about the history of this. Why do I need to know? Why is this important? It's really important because the cannabis field, much like the TCPA in a lot of ways, we got that Facebook ruling very recently limiting the scope of the auto dialer. The cannabis space, much like the TCPA realm, evolves very quickly and in a very strange ad hoc fashion that's different everywhere you go. I'm sure you're all aware of how different California is in the TCPA world, for instance. It's the same way with cannabis, okay? So by understanding where we were and how we got where we are now, we will better be able to predict where we're going. And I think that is key in this space where things really do change quickly. I wrote an article at the beginning of the year, and 4 months later, I had to change half of it because it was out of date. So let's go, pardon me. So then we're gonna talk about the supply chain in the cannabis products. This is a no-brainer. You need to know who the guys in the supply chain are. They're your potential clients. And you gotta know the cannabis products, because when you wanna talk to these guys, you don't wanna just walk the walk, you need to talk the talk. You need to know the industry parlance, and we're gonna get you there. Then we get to what I think maybe Ben, and likely all of you would consider the meat and potatoes of this presentation. We're actually gonna talk about how cannabis companies intersect with the TCPA and consumer protection specifically. Okay, we're gonna look at the unique Venn diagram crossover between these entities. And specifically, according to the sub-bulletins there, we're gonna talk about this intersection. We're gonna look at some relevant case law, including a couple that are really recent, have ramifications for the TCPA, not just the cannabis industry itself. Then we're gonna lead off with consumer protections. Now, next one, I'm sure a lot of you are very curious about this as well, and that's why it's towards the end of the presentation, so I get you to stick around. But once you actually have a cannabis client, how do you collect money from them?
Get paid.
It's a big deal. Everyone wants to get paid, and it's harder to do it with cannabis clients. But there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about what is and is not allowed. For instance, we're going to show you how you actually can use banks to store proceeds for cannabis clients. Always a better alternative than your mattress. And we're also going to talk a little about cybersecurity. Very hot topic. Everyone's talking about cybersecurity. Everywhere you go, you turn on the news, Colonial Pipeline hack, CD Projekt Red, a video game developer, just got hacked with ransomware. We got to talk about it because it's especially important in a field like the cannabis industry, where you will be dealing with health-related information in many situations. And finally, we're going to kick it over to Ben for some special hemp and CBD considerations. We had a little bit of a talk about this earlier, and it's exciting. So we're going to start with the general overview. Now, many of you, and I'm sure you see these terms all the time, cannabis, CBD, hemp. What are they? What's the difference? Well, we actually have a good answer now.
We discuss it ourselves from time to time.
At length. So the 2018 Farm Bill, you'll see it on there, actually legalized cannabis containing 0.3% or less tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the primary psychoactive compound in marijuana, hundreds of cannabinoids in the plant. CBD derived from hemp, or cannabidiol is what CBD means, another cannabinoid in the plant, is also legal. Cannabis above 0.3% THC remains federally illegal. However, we'll see conflicting state regimes. So let's talk about Cologne Ogden memo. Ben, would you like
Fair to say
speak a bit?
cannabis over the 0.3% is marijuana.
Yes. Ben, would you like to talk a bit about the Cole-Ogden memos for us, please?
Oh, well, the upshot is that even though the marijuana side of cannabis remained federally illegal because it remained on the controlled substances list, the Cole and Ogden memos were memos from Attorney General indicating that as long as state regimes remained compliant with their state laws, that the federal government was not inclined to pursue violations of the Controlled Substances Act for marijuana violations. You could probably expand on that a little bit more.
No, I think you did great. And that leads into the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment. This amendment actually prohibits the allocation of funds to the Department of Justice for the prosecution of state compliant marijuana regimes. It's a big deal. A lot of people didn't know about it, but it's another level of safety. We're going to talk about state regimes, guys. We got to talk about the different states because that's where the bulk of this is, okay? We're going to use Ohio as a touch point, not because we're an Ohio firm, we're national, you guys know that, but I think Ohio did a pretty good job establishing a fairly unique regulatory triumvirate. And they kind of looked at all the other states. We were a bit late to the game, 2018, and or Ohio was rather, and they kind of looked at all the states and said, well, you know, what's Colorado doing right? What's California doing right? What's Illinois doing wrong? We'll pick and choose. So we're going to talk about that. The 2018 Farm Bill. This is a big one, guys. It's the biggest change in federal policy with regards to marijuana and cannabis in 50 years since it was made federally illegal. We're going to talk about a hemp licensing scheme and what CBD is under this. And again, Ben will talk about this, but these are legal. Looking forward, where are we going to go? We talked a little bit about this, the Safe Banking Act. This would provide marijuana and cannabis companies access to FDIC insured banks, which they currently do not. Similarly, the MORE Act would actually just totally remove it from a Schedule I substance and, you know, frankly, legalize it, which is always exciting that that's actually something the feds are considering. Now, both these bills were in the previous Congress, but with the turnover into the new administration, that we have reintroduced the Safe Banking Act in the House and the MORE Act, or I'm sorry, the Safe Banking Act in the Senate and the MORE Act in the House. So the supply chain of the cannabis products, these are the guys that you want. We're going to start with something that a lot of people think of, I think, ancillary companies. These are the guys providing the lighting, the hydroponics, transportation. People don't think about them a lot, but they are relatively, I would say, one of the safer companies to work with. Not that these aren't all safe.
Yeah, you'd agree they're lower risk. I mean,
they're lower risk. They don't touch the plant, right? Speaking of people who touch the plant, cultivators. I'm sure you're all familiar with what they do. They grow the hemp and the cannabis depending on the tetrahydrocannabinol, the THC amount. Processors then take this hemp or cannabis and turn it into CBD oils, tinctures, and edibles. Now, interestingly, you can get some CBD above 0.3% THC, but that has to be under a state medical regime and it will not be federally legal. Dispensaries. These are a big one, obviously. These are the ones who are front-facing consumers. These are the ones who are going to be looking to you guys to get calling campaigns, drive this customer engagement, and up their cannabis products. And, you know, we're coming off the tail end of the pandemic, thankfully, but cannabis sales shot up through it and they don't really show any sign of slowing down. So you want to get this right. These guys are a big player and they are massive companies.
So, Chad, this might be an interesting place to bring up something we had talked about offline a few days ago. For call center customers, for the partners they're going to be working with, just because marijuana has been legalized at the state level in a given state, particularly medical marijuana, that doesn't necessarily mean that the end user is free under the state laws to consume it or ingest it any way they want, does it? I mean, it's not just the case that a call center is free to promote the smoking, for example, in every state where there might be end users. Is that accurate or no?
That is incredibly accurate, Ben. Actually, Ohio, for instance, prohibits smoking, which is, you know, how are you going to do it? So if you're calling into a state that has restrictions on certain types of consumption methods, you know, Ohio only allows vaping, edibles, oils, tinctures. Got to be cognizant of that. Got to be aware. Ben, this is your thing. Talk a bit about the CBD shops.
Oh, well, you know, I guess I'll give a little preview for the end here that I'm going to give away. But you mentioned a moment ago that, you know, if the THC content is over 0.3%, it wouldn't be legal at the federal level. I think one of the things that most people aren't aware about there is that the FDA has actually taken the position in writing that the use of CBD as a food additive or as a dietary supplement is already illegal. So within that supply chain, when you reach CBD shops, I don't know about everywhere, but at least in Ohio, they're almost ubiquitous, and it's fairly clear when you go into one that everyone's aware that what's being sold is CBD, usually for ingestion. Sometimes it'll be for a cream or something topically, but it's usually for human ingestion, either as a supplement or as an additive to food or an energy drink or a gummy or something along those lines. And I think what most people wouldn't be aware of is if you have one of those people as your partner, if you're a call center, they're actually in violation of the current understanding of the FDA regulations, and the FDA would consider those adulterated foods and illegal. There's a recently submitted bill by Senator Rand Paul and I think a couple of Oregon senators that would change that, or at least looks as though it would change it. But for the moment, the businesses that are selling CBD at the shop level, they're really operating outside of the law, and it's just the graces of the tolerance of the FDA has chosen not to go after them hard. But they've issued, I was going to mention this later, but they've issued a number of letters, I think 15 just.
And actions, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think most people are aware of that, but it's kind of one of the more interesting side of things.
Agreed. So let's get to it, the TCPA. So we've got the general concerns, right? We've got the TCPA concerns. But the marijuana and cannabis industry is also highly regulated, right?
Yeah.
We got the Board of Pharmacy, the Department of Commerce, and the State Pharmacy Board, Medical Board, all in Ohio, for instance, just alone.
And what do you think would be helpful for our listeners here to understand which aspect of the marijuana? So the medical board is going to regulate the doctors who are the ultimate source of where the cards are coming from.
Yes.
So in order to be authorized. The Board of Pharmacy, as I understand, would be dealing primarily with the dispensaries. And then Commerce would be dealing with the harvesters, the cultivators. Is that accurate?
I would say so, absolutely. So highly regulated. So they need good call centers. Products have a short shelf life, few weeks. Customer base skews younger. Always important that these kids love their text messaging. Again, it's highly scrutinized. And because it's highly scrutinized, they're worried about so much more. They aren't thinking about the TCPA. And guys, I'm going to bring you tomorrow's news today. We're going to get in a little bit, we're going to talk about the prototypical TCPA cannabis lawsuit that I am seeing pop up all over the place. And we want to help you avoid it. So consent, the main issue, these companies aren't getting the proper consent, right?
What's the key word here? What kind of consent?
Prior express written consent.
Written consent.
Exactly. Tale as old as time. Person walks into a dispensary, signs their name, gives a number. They think they can call them. You know that they can't. We know they can't. They don't know that they can't. So we're going to see a lot of lawsuits in the next slide.
And just to be clear on that point, we're talking about calls that are placed either with an auto dialer or with a pre-recorded or artificial voice as part of the message. And that's obviously who most of our listeners in the call center business, that's the realm that they're probably already very familiar with. But we are not saying, just in case we have any listeners who are dispensaries or something along those lines, that a teller, at the counter can't place a manual call to someone if they've left a number.
Absolutely. So we have record keeping concerns then too, because if they aren't keeping proper records, that's an issue. And then we of course have interstate calling concerns. Technically, if you're advertising cannabis products over federal airwaves, there could be an issue. But the federal government has taken a very, very strict hands-off stance, and I doubt that we would see any action like that. So it'd be totally inconsistent with everything over the past 20 years. Conflicting state and federal law, this is kind of the hallmark of the cannabis law and the industry. It's very rare that you would ever have something like this, but we do. So it's really important to get it right. And as a consequence, it's developed into an ad hoc state-based regulatory landscape. Ben, I would say there's a million different ways to skin a cat with this one, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, by that, for the audience, what Chad I think means is that unless you're talking about a specific state, you don't know exactly what the regulatory scheme is going to be. They vary.
Exactly. Case law, let's get into it, guys. I know this isn't the most fun stuff, but we need to know what we're working at. 5-Star Nutrition, really recent one out of the 5th Circuit a couple weeks ago. Actually contradicts an older 11th Circuit case saying 3 text messages weren't enough for standing under TCPA. In the 5th Circuit, a single text is now enough. Not good stuff. We don't love to see it, but it is what it is. eSolutions, Ben, I know we both know them, 51,000 member class action, absolutely massive company. We hate to see them get hit with this. And they actually, a lot of people know this, the settlements of the scope have to be approved by a judge, and they had to come back and basically double it. rough stuff. Curaleaf, another big boy. The Curaleafs, the PharmaCans, the Harvest Grows, the Eases. These are the big ones. They're getting hit. Allegations of thousands of calls. This one's working its way through. And I was looking at some of the materials, Ben. I think there might be some exposures, a little rough. Various texting cases. Ben, this is exactly what I was saying. A person walks in, signs their name, provides their number, and this happens. You know, it happens all the time, and we're seeing smaller ones, but these companies are getting hit with tens of thousands in fines regular. It's not good. And finally, the Visalis case. Guys, this one is my favorite. Ben was talking about those warning letters. I was talking about those enforcement actions. Here you go. This guy got hit with $25 million for saying his CBD was, you know, going to cure cancer. So I know you guys want to do that, but that's a huge verdict. He actually and comically tried to appeal it under the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution, arguing it was an excessive fine and punishment.
I don't blame him for trying.
I don't either, but the court sure did. Didn't like it. Consumer protections, client insurance. Guys, you got TCPA insurance, but it's probably got an exclusionary policy for, you know, something that would be considered federally illegal. So that's kind of a bummer. But there is cannabis specific TCPA insurance, right? But Ben, we had a discussion about it. You've been hearing some rumblings about cannabis TCPA insurance.
Yeah, I think the concern is that you have a insurer who you trust to be a stand-up business partner, because there's an argument to be made that the insurance policy to cover something that's federally illegal would be void as against public policy. So if you had an insurer who, when it came time to pay on a policy, even though the policy was aimed specifically at the cannabis industry, if you had an insurer who was unscrupulous about their responsibilities, they could easily argue that the policy is unenforceable. And I don't know whether that would be effective or not, but it's at least a colorable argument. So
it's fascinating.
The possibility for, you should get insurance that's aimed at the cannabis industry, but even then you want to make sure you have an insurer who you trust is going to stand behind their policy, even if there might be a way to legally weasel out of it.
Yeah, that goes into due diligence for vendors. You want a good insurance guy. So going into scripts, you got to be careful, and this ties into claim substantiation, UDAP, guys. If you're going to be making health claims about certain cannabis, like this is good for sleeping, this is good for digestion, what's interesting is that has to be supported by reliable and competent scientific evidence, but we don't really have that. It's been illegal, so we don't have all these studies and everything, you know, so it's really hard to substantiate this. Ben, I told you, I think I've kind of cracked the code, so to speak. You talk about everything but the product itself. Talk about the amino acids, talk about the terpenes. But the problem with that, go ahead.
Well, we're not going to consider that legal advice exactly, but I like where your head's at with that. And I really think that that probably is an angle, particularly the terpenes.
But the problem is you need to know the science, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you need, so that's why we're here. You need counsel who can help you sift through this kind of stuff, because we've looked at the materials, we know the science, we've looked at the substantiation. UDAP laws, if you run afoul of what we were just talking about, UDAP city, you're falling into unfair, deceptive, abusive, and unconscionable trade practice categories, and you don't want to do that, because I mean that's not really the FCC or the FDA, it's the FTC, but you also risk drawing the ire of state regulatory attorney generals and other bodies, and that's never good. Those guys are quicker and more active.
The less likely you fly under the radar once you get their attention. Yeah, and that's a great, terrible way to get their attention.
It is. Cannabis companies as TCPA targets. We of course got the professional plaintiffs, the Cunninghams, the Warshams. You know them, you don't love them, but they're here. The FCC has the TCPA. The FDA has the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. The FTC has of course, the FTC synonymous FTC Act. And the DEA just kind of has regulatory authority to go after people in violation of controlled substances. Not to scare you off. There's ways to deal with all of them, especially if you're doing things legally. But just something to be aware of. Banking and security concerns. All right, here we go, guys. How to get the actual money? Well, you have to follow the PCI standards. You guys likely are. Not sure if cannabis companies are. It's a little iffy. You know, some of them are, some of them aren't allowed specialized POS systems. So that's where the auditing comes in. You know, you need your attorney to go in there and look at their POS systems. You gotta worry about HIPAA for medical ones because they're dealing with medical information. Best practices, Ben, I always say it's best practice. Everything is separate.
Yeah.
You don't cross your verticals. You don't downsell to a different vertical over here. You keep a separate bank account. everything.
Don't commingle the funds.
Don't commingle, because if the feds come after the funds and they want the cannabis funds and they're mixing with everything else, they're going to go after everything else. We do that at our firm, actually. We keep them separate. So always a good idea. CBD and hemp, Ben, these are legal, so not the same issue.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other day, and I haven't seen this come up. So with CBD and hemp, you don't have the same concerns about keeping the funds away from your other funds, since they are legal at the federal level. But something did occur to me. It's possible for a CBD crop to end up testing hot. And I wouldn't want to necessarily trust the federal government to be on your team if they saw an opening to try and say, okay, well, and by hot, I mean if it tests over the 0.3% THC and is therefore marijuana as opposed to CBD. If they therefore, for some reason, wanted to try to claim that those funds were, inappropriate, or they were marijuana funds. I haven't seen that happen, but I guess that's something I would be mindful of. So it still might be a good best practice to segregate even those funds.
Excellent. General concerns, Ben, you want to talk about the general concerns by actually putting this into a bank?
Well, yeah, so Chad, we were talking the other day, and my understanding is that it's not the case that FDIC banks or banks are outright prohibited from dealing with cannabis companies, but there were just so many hoops and it was so burdensome that as a practical matter, all but all of them have decided it's not worth it, and they just won't take money that's closely enough associated with the cannabis industry, at least the marijuana side.
That's 100% right. 100% right. And actually, the 2014 Department of Treasury guidance right there says you're allowed. Guys, if you ever have the chance, go read it. It's actually kind of funny. It has stuff like smell the money, make sure it doesn't smell like cannabis. And it was from their FinSec division, financial security, and actually said you were allowed, but as a practical matter, they're scared. They don't want it. And yeah, I kind of understand where they're coming from. But that's where charter banks come up. And Ben, when I talk about charter banks, I'm also including credit unions,
okay.
Kind of wrapping this all up into the same, but basically non-FDIC insured banks. They want the money. They're hungry for it. They aren't prohibited from the feds. And in some states like Ohio, which has a closed loop payment system in development, they're actually encouraged and they have some legal protections. So best practices, guys, set up a separate account at a charter bank to collect all this money from these cannabis clients. We saw it. They're in the billions of dollars. You don't want to miss out on it. But we also absolutely have to be aware of cyber security. These companies are targets for hacks because they are very cash rich. They have high turnover in terms of cash flow and a lot of overhead to cover. So it's a lot of churning. And Ben, I think you made a very astute observation. If, who's going to help them if they get a cyber attack? The feds? Probably not. This isn't Colonial Pipeline. So you got to be careful of this because health information, separate concerns. Again,
and then operating on I think part of what we mean there too is operating, I don't want to say on the fringes, but in a gray area, it seems you'd be a likely target. You'd be an easy target.
Absolutely. And segueing right into the ransomware and anecdotal incidents, I've seen a lot of this over the past couple months, really. It seems like during the pandemic, things really took off in terms of cyber attacks. And unfortunately, cannabis clients were a pretty regular target of that. That being said, they've stepped their game up dramatically. But what's important is you don't want them to have access to your systems. Keep everything separate. And this is a good rule from a general agency vicarious liability perspective. Keep the systems separate. If they want to be able to upload leads to you, again, verify those, make sure they have the proper consent language. All goes back to proper auditing with the consumer protection concerns. A little bit of work at the forefront prevents a lot of headache at the end. So again, auditing them, making sure and ensuring that they are up to par is always an important consideration. And with that being said, Ben, let's turn to some, we talked a bit about it, right? But other than the fact that that cannabis is federally illegal above the 0.3%, there's more to this.
So what I find interesting, and the way I think about it, and both being in our cannabis practice group, but we kind of handle different sides of things. I kind of think of hemp as being sort of the mirror image of marijuana. And what I mean by that is, with the marijuana situation, the federal government basically said with the Cole memo and Rohrbacher and that sort of thing that they're going to take a hands-off approach. And it's the states that took an aggressive approach to set up a scheme to legalize it or to partially legalize it. Whereas with hemp, it's the federal government that took the proactive approach and said, we're going to legalize it. and they've taken a very hands-on approach as far as what the regulatory scheme will be to regulate hemp and hemp-derived products. But it's the states where if there's going to be an impediment, that impediment's going to arise because some of the states, even though it's legal at the federal level, are opposed to it and still have hemp either classified as marijuana or just otherwise illegal to harvest or to possess as an end user, or in some cases to finance. So for hemp, it's regulated by the USDA. At least the regulatory scheme is set up by the USDA, and that's by virtue of the 2018 Farm Bill. The USDA has put out a few different letters. They put out an interim final letter not terribly long ago, but then I think in March they put out what's supposed to be a final letter updating the regulatory scheme.
You gotta love those agencies with all those steps.
Well, and it's unclear how long that will be in effect, if at all, given that it was right about the change in administrations where they put that through.
Well, and they just, Ben, we just received word yesterday, actually, of our new FTC commissioner, Ms. Khan, as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So the USDA sets up the regulatory scheme, then the states have to have their own regulatory scheme that comports with the federal scheme. And then on top of that, the Farm Bill was clear that even though it was removing hemp from the definition of marijuana and thereby removing it from the Controlled Substances Act, and that's what we mean when we usually say that it's been made legal at the federal level, that it doesn't interrupt the Food and Drug Administration's ability to regulate those things that it traditionally regulated. So food additives, dietary supplements, pet foods, cosmetics, and to the extent that hemp or hemp-derived products, in particular CBD, are used in food or dietary supplements, the FDA still retains regulatory authority over those products and can declare them to be illegal, notwithstanding the removal of hemp from the Controlled Substances Act.
And you know, Ben, at that point, I mentioned earlier there was they're doing enforcement. I actually had a gentleman call me a few months back asking if there was anything we could do, and unfortunately, he didn't hire us at the beginning, so it was too late, and he had signed a settlement. But the FTC came after his CBD shop for making.
Oh yeah, you mentioned.
Yeah. Came after him for making unsubstantiated health claims and benefits. And guys, they went after him for 600 grand, and then they went after him personally when they shuttered the store. It was, you know, we've seen in the news about all these warning letters, and all of a sudden I'm like, wow, the enforcement actions have already started.
So in any event, in many ways, on the hemp side of things, there are less things to be worried about. You don't have to worry about the banking, but there are its own concerns because you have to comply with the regulatory scheme that the USDA has set out, and it can be unclear and is evolving. As you said, things are rapidly changing.
Now you're
and you have to
DEA.
also, well, yeah, you also, if you go astray, you also have to be in compliance with the state's implementation of the program to meet the USDA requirements. And you know, the fact is that those implementations are not terribly consistent. Different testers, different states have different attitudes about how much of the plant needs to be used for sample, how much it needs to be homogenized, whether you can take what portion of the plant, whether you take just the top few inches or more than just the top few inches.
And Ben, to that point, right, we visited a processor really, and it's a beautiful, wonderful science, but some of these websites, the gentleman was telling us, you can click whether you think it will be high or low THC before you send it in. It's just what you think it might be.
We've talked to some of the labs as well who've indicated that the quality of the certificate of analysis that you get after testing is not consistent. Different labs conduct different quality of tests. Different labs have different personal integrity about what they're willing to say and not say. I don't want to slander anybody, but there's a gamut there that is run. So point I'm trying to get at is that even though it's federally legal, there's now the federal regulatory scheme, which actually means in a way there's sort of more on your business. And even though it's legal federally, states have fairly wide latitude to pass their own restrictions and prohibitions. Now, what they can't do is prohibit the interstate transport of hemp, as long as it's going to a legal destination. So you're allowed to drive it through their state, notwithstanding the other laws that they're allowed to have to prohibit its use or finance or cultivation within their state. For some reason, this has kind of been a difficult thing for states and local governments to except though, I mean, it was written into the Farm Bill. The USDA had given a written interpretation that you couldn't prevent the interstate transport. There was a case in federal court in Indiana that went all the way to the 7th Circuit last year, where they solidified the idea that yes, interstate transport is permitted. But even though it's permitted, you know, if you've got clients who are transporting hemp and they don't have a quality certificate of analysis to show the local authorities, and they don't have a bill of lading to show, hey, this is where we started and this is where we're going. So that, in other words, so that it's clear that you are taking advantage, or that your partner is taking advantage of the right to travel interstate, and it's clear that it's not marijuana because that certificate of analysis is clear. And I would also say that the material is all sealed, so it's clear it hasn't been adulterated with. You run a risk of having to deal with headaches even if you win in the end. And frankly, you still run that risk. If you come across a local law enforcement officer and he's not familiar with the current state of CBD law and he thinks he's just made the bust of his life, you know, your driver might still be spending a night or two in jail while things get sorted out.
Unfortunately. So, Ben, you know, we're running low on time here. I want to be respectful of everyone's times, but one other thing I'd like to touch on is if you're dealing with hemp, a lot of your customers are going to be B2B, right? Mm-hmm. Business to business.
Yeah. Private labeling and stuff as well.
Private labeling, agricultural, industrial type stuff. But go ahead, finish on off. And
well, I guess you know, there were a couple. I was going to make the point that claim substantiation is also a big thing in hemp, because so many of the end products of hemp are advertised as being therapeutic. And I think we touched on this a little bit, so I won't go into too much more depth, but that's one thing that is consistent between marijuana and CBD, and it maybe even more so since the feds aren't as hands-off. When you're making, and you mentioned the fellow, you know, with the $600,000 judgment, I guess it was against him.
Unfortunately.
When you're making representations about the therapeutic effects of CBD, you're asking for the negative attention of the FTC and the FDA. I guess the last point I would make that's an interesting distinction that your clients or that your business partners might be able to benefit from. In the marijuana side of things, you can't get trademark protection since marijuana is federally illegal. But when it comes to CBD products, hemp products, you're actually eligible, or your partners would be eligible for receiving trademark protection, whereas, you know, their marijuana counterparts would maybe only be able to try and backdoor their way into intellectual property protection through copyright. But even that is somewhat limited, because if you're dealing with a CBD product that is illegal because of the FDA's determination that it's being advertised as a food or a dietary supplement, it's still probably going to be rejected from trademark protection.
Absolutely.
I don't know if we had any time for any questions, Chad, but I know we had a few come in. The one about the packaging I thought was pretty interesting.
We're running low on time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I will get to one, and we'll answer through email as well, but I will get to one interesting question we got. The question was, is there interest in going green in terms of packaging in the marijuana industry? And I remember Ben was sitting here, he's like, there's nothing there in terms of a question, right? I was like, oh, there's a lot.
I just didn't know as much as you do.
For those who are not in the know, the FTC has like a 70-page green guide on this exact topic. It covers terms such as organic. It covers terms such as 100% natural, all green. And there's a lot of rules. They also have a free guide which deals with offering items as free. I'm thinking joints for jabs in Washington, right? But the issue you run there, if something is free, then that essentially becomes a standard product offering and you're diluting it. So back to the question, are they interested in going green? 100%, obviously, in any way you can think of. But a lot of these companies take pride in using no pesticides, no agricultural hormones, and having safe, sustainable packaging for their products. So it is an absolutely massive push in the industry. And it also invokes the FTC and some regulatory authority, which is something not a lot of folks think about, the rules behind all natural. And there are, just as there are with anything. But like I said, we got a bunch of other questions. The engagement for this one was really fantastic, guys. We love to see it. We love getting the questions. We love helping you. So we're going to answer those and we're going to blast it out to you. But given the time constraints, I think that's it for us today. So thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure doing this webinar. And feel free to reach out with any further questions. And we had a wonderful time presenting for you.
Thank you all for joining us. And I guess since we still got a live mic, we'll wait for our producer Mallory to count us out.